They told us Admiral Verson died 30 years ago, executed for losing an entire battle group at Damocles Gulf. I watched him sleep 3 feet from my bunk last night. When I asked him how long he'd been here, he smiled and said, "Long enough to see men like you arrive 217 times. I don't know which terrifies me more, that he's telling the truth, or that the Imperium wants me to believe him." The arrest came 14 hours after the collision. I was still on the bridge when the commissariat aides arrived, their boots silent against the deck plating, their faces hidden behind rebreather grills that hissed with each measured breath. They did not speak. They simply stood at the threshold of the command dais and waited, hands folded behind their backs, until I acknowledged them. My second officer looked at me with eyes that held no judgment, only the flat recognition of inevitability. I remember wondering if he had already been briefed, if he had known before I did that my service was over. The collision had killed 4,000 crew across 2 vessels. A mistimed warp translation. A single error in coordinate verification. My error. They escorted me through corridors I had walked for 6 years, past crew who turned their faces away or studied their consoles with sudden intensity. No one met my eyes. The commissariat does not arrest quietly, but neither does it announce. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows their arrival, a weight that presses against the bulkheads and makes even the machine spirits seem to hold their breath. I had seen it before, twice, when other officers were taken. I had not imagined how it would feel to be the center of that silence, to know that every eye that refused to look at me was performing an act of self-preservation. Association with failure is its own contagion. The transport shuttle was unmarked, its interior stripped of all insignia and comfort. I sat on a bare metal bench between 2 commissariat troopers who never looked at me, their lasguns held across their chests in a posture that was neither threatening nor reassuring. The flight took 3 hours. I counted the minutes by the rhythm of the atmospheric processors, a low mechanical hymn that filled the silence where questions should have been. No one told me where we were going. No one told me what would happen. The Imperium does not owe explanations to the failed. We docked at an orbital facility I had never seen marked on any fleet chart. The exterior was gunmetal gray, studded with sensor arrays and defensive turrets that tracked our approach with slow, deliberate precision. No windows, no external designation codes, just a series of docking clamps that seized our shuttle with a finality that made my chest tighten. The troopers stood, and I stood with them, my legs stiff from the long silence. They guided me through an airlock that cycled 3 times, each pressurization sequence accompanied by a wash of antiseptic mist that left my skin cold and my uniform damp. The processing chamber was white. Not the white of Imperial banners or the pale marble of temple floors, but a sterile, lightless white that seemed to devour color and sound. A servitor awaited me, its face replaced by a brass grill, and its arms ending in data probe digits that clicked and whirred with mechanical patience. It gestured to a raised platform in the center of the room. I stepped onto it. The platform rotated slowly while the servitor's sensors swept across me, red light painting lines across my chest, my face, my hands. A voice emerged from a Vox grill embedded in the ceiling, flat and without inflection. Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss, Imperial Navy. Service record, 12 years. Commendations, 4. Disciplinary notes, none. Current status, detained pending evaluation. The servitor approached and began removing my rank insignia with tools that were too precise to be called gentle. Each pin, each braid, each mark of achievement was catalogued and placed into a steel tray. My uniform remained, but it was no longer mine. It was a shell, a reminder of what I had been. The servitor stepped back, and a section of the wall slid open to reveal a narrow corridor lit by dim red lumen strips. I walked forward because there was nowhere else to go. The corridor stretched longer than the facility's exterior dimensions should have allowed. I passed sealed doors marked with numbers in High Gothic, each one identical, each one silent. My footsteps echoed against the walls in a rhythm that felt accusatory. At the corridor's end, a single door stood open. I stepped through into a cell that measured 4 meters by 3, with 2 bunks bolted to opposite walls, a shared washing alcove behind a thin partition, and a single overhead lumen that cast everything in shades of gray. The man on the lower bunk looked up from a battered data slate and smiled. He was older than any active officer I had ever seen. His hair white but his eyes sharp. His uniform faded but still recognizably Navy issue. The collar bore the remnants of Admiral's braiding, worn nearly smooth by time or deliberate erasure. He set the data slate aside and stood, extending a hand in a gesture so casually formal that for a moment I forgot where I was. "Verson," he said, "welcome to the Penitent Spire." I stared at him. The name struck me like a physical blow, dragging up memories of academy lectures and whispered warnings. Admiral Verson, the cautionary tale, the man whose name was invoked to illustrate the cost of hesitation, the Damocles Gulf disaster. An entire battle group lost to Tau ambush because of a delayed retreat order. 6 capital ships, 30,000 dead. Verson, who had been court-martialed in absentia because his body was never recovered, presumed killed in the flagship's destruction. Verson, who had become a ghost story, a name used to frighten junior officers into decisiveness. "You're dead," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to myself. He laughed, a quiet sound that held no bitterness, only a kind of weary amusement. "So they tell me. Sit down, Voss. You look like you're about to collapse." I sat on the upper bunk because it was the only space left, my legs folding mechanically beneath me. Verson returned to his seat and picked up his data slate again, scrolling through text I could not see. The silence stretched between us, and I realized he was waiting for me to ask. The Imperium trains its officers to assess, to question, to seek tactical advantage even in surrender. He knew I would not be able to resist. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He did not look up. 30 standard years, 4 months, 18 days. Though time is a flexible commodity in places like this. You'll learn. But you're supposed to be dead. Yes. Executed for cowardice and catastrophic incompetence. The official record is very clear. He set the data slate down and met my eyes, and I saw something in his expression that was worse than madness or despair. I saw clarity. The official record serves its purpose. Reality serves another. My mouth was dry. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but the words tangled in my throat. Verson tilted his head, studying me with the calm attention of a naval tactician analyzing an enemy formation. "You're wondering if I'm real," he said. "If this is some kind of test or conditioning exercise. If perhaps your mind has fractured under the weight of your failure and I'm simply a manifestation of guilt." He smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in it. "I assure you, I am quite real, and you are quite sane, for now." "Why are you here?" I managed. "For the same reason you are. For the same reason 216 others have been brought to this cell before you. Because the Imperium does not waste resources, Voss. Not ships, not ammunition, and certainly not officer-class minds. Failure is not the end. It is the beginning of a very particular kind of education." He stood and moved to the cell's single narrow viewport, a slit of armored glass no wider than my hand. Beyond it, I could see the curve of a planet below, its surface obscured by industrial smog and the geometric lights of Hive City sprawl. Verson gestured toward it with one hand. "Do you know what this facility is called in the records that acknowledge its existence?" "The Reconsecration Spire, a place where failed Imperial officers are given the opportunity to redeem themselves through contemplation, retraining, and service. Very noble, very merciful." He turned back to me, and his expression had gone cold. "The officers who built it called it something else, the engine, because that is what it does. It takes broken components and reshapes them into useful instruments. Some are reforged, some are melted down, and some," he paused, his gaze distant, "some are kept as examples." I wanted to stand, to pace, to do anything but sit on this bunk and absorb his words. But my body felt locked in place, every muscle tense, with the effort of simply remaining upright. Verson watched me with the patience of a man who had seen this reaction many times before. "They didn't tell you about the third option, did they?" he asked. "What?" "When they brief you. When they explain your choices. Servitor conversion or reconsecration trial. 2 paths. Very clear, very binary." He returned to his bunk and sat, leaning back against the wall with his hands folded across his chest. "They never mention the third option. The one you have to discover on your own." "What option?" "Refusal. You can refuse both. Accept permanent detention. Live here, in this cell, until your body fails. No reconditioning, no trial, no hope of release. Just existence. His eyes never left mine. Most officers don't believe it's real. They think it's a trick, a test of resolve. They choose one of the two paths, because choice implies dignity. And dignity is the last thing we cling to when everything else is stripped away. And you? I asked. Which did you choose? His smile returned, but this time it carried no warmth at all. I graduated, Voss. 30 years ago, I completed the reconsecration trial. I was released back into fleet service with full rank restoration and a commendation for my commitment to the Emperor's will. I served for 5 years aboard the vessel St. Macharius, a grand cruiser assigned to the Segmentum Tempestus Border Patrol. I commanded with distinction. I made no errors. I was the model of rehabilitated competence. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And then they brought me back. The lumen overhead flickered, casting his face into momentary shadow. When it steadied, I saw that his expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had gone distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the cell's walls. "You'll meet the others tomorrow," he said, his tone shifting back to something almost conversational. "The facility processes officers in cohorts, 60 cells per wing, 2 officers per cell. Some will be here for weeks, some for years. You'll learn to recognize the patterns. The ones who break quickly, the ones who resist, the ones who smile too much." He picked up his data slate again, dismissing me with the gesture. "Sleep if you can. The first recollection session begins at 0600. You'll want to be rested." I opened my mouth to ask what a recollection session was, but Verson had already returned his attention to whatever text filled his screen, his face illuminated by its pale glow. The conversation was over. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the underside of the cell's ceiling where decades of condensation had left faint stains in patterns that almost resembled maps. My mind raced through everything he had said, every implication, every gap in his story. Admiral Verson. Alive. Imprisoned. Graduated and returned. The thought that would not leave me, the one that circled through my exhaustion like a carrion bird, was this. If the Imperium brought him back after 5 years of perfect service, what did that say about the purpose of this place? What did that say about redemption? I did not sleep that night. I listened to Verson's breathing, slow and even, and tried to convince myself that he was simply a broken man, a cautionary tale made flesh, a ghost story given voice by my own guilt, but I could not shake the memory of his smile, nor the precise way he had said 217. Not 200. Not roughly 200. Exactly 217. As if he had been counting, as if each new arrival was a tally mark in some calculation I could not yet see. When the lumen brightened to signal morning cycle, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the exact moment I had given the order that killed 4,000 souls, trying to remember if I had given it at all, or if I had simply been told that I had. The recollection session began with silence. A servitor arrived at precisely 0600, its augmetic hand rapping twice against the cell door before the lock disengaged with a pneumatic hiss. Verson did not move from his bunk. He simply gestured toward the open doorway with one hand, his eyes still closed, his breathing undisturbed. I stood because there was no alternative, my muscles stiff from a sleepless night, and followed the servitor into the corridor. The halls were no longer empty. Officers moved in single file, each one dressed in the same faded uniform, each one walking with eyes forward and hands clasped behind their backs. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps and the distant hum of atmospheric processors. I fell into line behind a woman whose uniform bore the remnants of administratum insignia, her hair cropped short, her posture rigid despite the exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders. She did not acknowledge me. None of them did. We descended through 3 levels, via a spiral ramp that curved along the facility's outer wall. Through narrow viewports, I caught glimpses of the planet below vast sprawls of industrial sectors, smoke rising in columns that never seemed to dissipate, the grey-brown crust of a world given entirely to production, a hive world, though I did not know its name. Perhaps it had no name. Perhaps it existed solely to provide a backdrop for this place, a reminder of what the Imperium built and what it demanded in return. The recollection chamber was a vast circular room divided into individual booths by walls of frosted glass. Each booth contained a single chair, a data slate mounted on an adjustable arm, and a picked recorder lens embedded in the ceiling. The servitor guided me to booth 17 and gestured for me to sit. I obeyed. The glass walls rose higher than my head, cutting off any view of the other officers, isolating me in a space that felt simultaneously exposed and claustrophobic. The data slate activated, its screen glowing with soft amber light. Text appeared, rendered in precise high Gothic script. Recollection protocol. State your name, rank, and nature of failure. I spoke my name. The words felt foreign, as if I were reading them from someone else's service record. Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss, Imperial Navy. Assigned to the cruiser Validus Irae. My failure. A mistimed warp translation that resulted in a collision with the escort frigate Constant Vigil. 4,273 casualties. My error. My responsibility. My sin against the Emperor's servants. The data slate absorbed my words, the text scrolling upward as I spoke, each sentence recorded with mechanical precision. When I finished, new text appeared. Describe the sequence of events leading to the failure. I did. I walked through the hours before the translation, the routine checks, the coordinates provided by the navigator's choir, the final verification sequence that I had delegated to my second officer. I described the moment of translation, the sickening lurch as the warp's boundary was crossed, and the immediate blare of collision alarms. I described the impact, the way the ship shuddered and groaned, the Vox channels flooding with damage reports and screams. I described standing on the bridge and knowing, with absolute certainty, that I had killed thousands because I had trusted a subordinate to perform a task I should have verified myself. The data slate recorded it all. When I stopped speaking, my throat raw, new text appeared. Identify all decisions that contributed to the failure. This continued for 2 hours. Each question peeled back another layer, demanding greater specificity, forcing me to examine every choice, every assumption, every moment of complacency that had led to disaster. The data slate never offered judgment or commentary. It simply absorbed my confession, an unblinking mechanical priest that recorded my guilt with perfect fidelity. When the session ended, the data slate went dark, and the booth's glass walls descended into the floor. I stood on shaking legs and saw the other officers emerging from their own booths. Faces blank, eyes distant. We filed back to our cells in the same silent procession, and I understood why Verson had not joined us. He had done this before. He had done this for 30 years. He was awake when I returned, sitting cross-legged on his bunk with the data slate balanced on one knee. He looked up as I entered, his expression measuring. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," I said, though the word was insufficient for the hollowness in my chest. "Not tired, empty. There's a difference." He set the data slate aside. "The first session is always the worst. You believe you're simply recounting facts, providing an accurate record for evaluation. But language is a strange thing, Voss. The more you speak a narrative, the more it solidifies. Memory is not fixed. It is clay, and recollection is the hand that shapes it." I sat on my bunk and stared at the floor. "They're recording my confession. They're constructing it," Verson corrected. "By the time you've repeated your failure 100 times, you won't remember which version is true. You'll remember the one you've spoken most often, the one they've guided you to speak." I wanted to argue, but exhaustion pressed against the inside of my skull like a physical weight. Verson stood and moved to the washing alcove, running water over his hands in a gesture that seemed more ritual than functional. When he returned, his expression had softened slightly. "You'll attend recollection every day for the first month. After that, the frequency depends on your progress. Some officers complete the process in 6 months. Some take years. Some never complete it at all." He sat again, hands folded in his lap. "The facility measures progress by something they call guilt crystallization. It's a term borrowed from mechanicus metallurgy. The idea is that raw ore must be refined, impurities burned away, until what remains is pure and structurally sound. And if it doesn't crystallize, then you are impure, irredeemable, fit only for servitor conversion or permanent detention." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. The Imperium is very efficient. Nothing is wasted. The days that followed adopted a rhythm that was both monotonous and suffocating. Morning recollection sessions, midday ration distribution, a flavorless protein paste and a cup of recycled water delivered by servitors that never spoke. Afternoon isolation, during which we were confined to our cells with nothing but our thoughts and whatever reading material Verson chose to share from his data slate. Evening hymns, broadcast through Vox speakers embedded in the walls, the same litanies of duty and sacrifice repeated until the words lost meaning and became mere sound. The facility's architecture revealed itself slowly. The penitent spire was divided into 5 wings, each one color-coded by lumen strip hue. Our wing glowed red, marking us as officers whose failures had resulted in mass casualties. The blue wing, Verson explained, housed those who had committed failures of judgment, retreats without authorization, refusals to execute orders, hesitation in the face of Xenos threats. Green was for logistical failures, officers who had allowed supply lines to collapse or equipment to degrade. Yellow for intelligence failures, white for failures so catastrophic or sensitive that their nature was classified even within the facility. We never saw the white wing. It existed on the lowest level, accessible only through checkpoints guarded by commissariat troopers in full combat gear. Verson claimed he had been there once, decades ago, when a White Wing officer was transferred to our section for reasons never explained. The man had lasted 3 days before he stopped speaking entirely, and 2 weeks before he was removed on a gurney, his eyes open but unseeing. "What did he do?" I asked. Verson shook his head. He never said, but I saw his uniform before they processed him. Naval Intelligence, Codebreaker Division, whatever he failed at. It was significant enough that even acknowledging it would be dangerous. I began to recognize patterns among the other officers. The woman from the administratum who walked ahead of me in the recollection line, her name was Kellor. Though I only learned this by overhearing a servitor's roll call check. She had overseen a tithe collection that resulted in famine across an entire hive sector. 17 million dead from starvation while grain shipments rotted in orbital warehouses due to clerical errors she had failed to catch. She moved through the facility like a ghost, her face expressionless, her participation in routines mechanical. There was a guard captain named Thrace who had ordered an artillery barrage on coordinates he had not verified, killing 3 companies of his own infantry. He sat in the communal washroom during allotted hygiene hours and stared at his hands as if expecting to see blood that would not wash away. He never spoke, but sometimes at night I could hear him weeping through the thin walls, a sound that was raw and animal and deeply human. An Arbeitsenforcer named Carter had hesitated during a riot suppression, her moment of mercy allowing an entire district to descend into anarchy. 2,000 dead in the fires that followed. She carried herself with the rigid discipline of her order, but her eyes were hollow. And during recollection sessions, I could hear her voice through the glass walls, repeating the same phrases over and over, as if trying to convince herself they were true. Verson watched them all with the detachment of a naval strategist studying enemy movements. He kept notes on his data slate, observations rendered in terse shorthand that he never let me read directly but would sometimes reference in our evening conversations. "Keller will crystallize within 4 months, he said one night, his voice low enough that it would not carry beyond our cell. She's already accepting the narrative. You can see it in the way she walks, less resistance, more automation. She'll be released and reassigned to a minor logistical post where her competence can be monitored." And Thrace? Servitor conversion. He's breaking, not crystallizing. The guilt is consuming him rather than shaping him. They'll wait another month to be certain, but the outcome is already determined. He glanced at me. "You should avoid him. Association with the condemned carries its own risks." Risks. The facility evaluates more than individual guilt. It assesses compatibility, resilience, capacity for rehabilitation within acceptable parameters. Officers who form attachments to those deemed irredeemable are often flagged for additional scrutiny. It suggests poor judgment, an inability to recognize lost causes. He returned his attention to the data slate. The Imperium values discernment. I wanted to argue that turning away from a suffering man was inhuman, but the words died in my throat. Humanity was not a currency that held value here. Only utility, only function. I thought of Thrace weeping alone in his cell and wondered if I would be able to hear it when they came for him, or if the servitors moved too silently for such things to be noticed. The facility's hierarchy extended beyond wing colors. Within our section, cells were arranged by severity of failure, measured by casualty count and strategic impact. Verson and I occupied cell 43, placing us in the middle range. Significant failures, but not catastrophic. Cells 1 through 20 housed the worst, officers whose errors had cost entire fleets, planets, or campaigns. Cells 50 through 60 were reserved for lesser failures, officers who had killed dozens or hundreds rather than thousands. This arrangement was not accidental. During the brief periods when we were allowed into communal spaces, the washing room, the small exercise yard that opened for 30 minutes each evening, the hierarchy was palpable. Officers from the lower numbered cells moved with a particular kind of defeated arrogance, as if their magnitude of failure granted them perverse status. Those from higher numbers kept their distance, perhaps fearing contamination, perhaps simply grateful they were not worse. Verson navigated this social landscape with practiced ease. He spoke to no one but me, acknowledged no one, maintained a distance that was neither hostile nor friendly. He simply existed, a fixed point around which the facility's population orbited without ever quite touching. "You're known," I said one evening after watching several officers give him furtive glances during our yard time. "I'm old," he replied. "Age is unusual here. Most officers either graduate or break within 5 years. Those of us who remain longer become curiosities. Why do you remain?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the planet beyond the viewport. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard before. "Because I know what happens to those who graduate, and I know what happens to those who refuse, and I have chosen neither, Voss. I have chosen something else entirely." He turned to face me, and his expression was unreadable. "I have chosen to witness." Before I could ask what he meant, the lumen strips dimmed to signal sleep cycle, and the conversation was over. I lay in the darkness and listened to the facility's machinery hum through the walls, a sound that was almost like breathing, and wondered how many officers had lain in this same bunk, staring at this same ceiling, asking themselves the same questions I could not answer. The first month passed in a blur of repetition. Recollection sessions grew longer, the questions more invasive, the demands for detail more exhaustive. I found myself describing events I did not remember experiencing, filling gaps in my narrative with assumptions that became certainties through repetition. Verson had been right. Memory was clay. I could feel it reshaping beneath the weight of my own words. But there were cracks in the facility's routine, moments when the machinery revealed its seams. I began to notice servitors that paused fractionally too long in doorways, as if listening. I saw commissariat overseers observing us through one-way viewing ports, their silhouettes visible only when the angle of light shifted. I heard sounds at night that should not exist in a sealed facility, distant voices, footsteps in corridors that were supposed to be empty, the occasional muffled impact that might have been a door closing or something heavier. Verson noticed my noticing. One evening, as we prepared for sleep cycle, he leaned down from his bunk and spoke in a whisper that barely carried the distance between us. "You're starting to see it. The structure beneath the structure. Good. That means you're not broken yet." He paused. "Tomorrow, during yard time, watch the north wall. Third panel from the left, lower section. Watch what happens when the servitor patrol passes. Why? Because you need to understand what this place is before you can decide what you're going to do about it." He pulled back, ending the conversation, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next evening, I did as he instructed. The yard was a small enclosure, open to vacuum on one side with a reinforced transparent barrier, enclosed by metal walls on the other 3. Officers moved in slow circles or stood in isolated contemplation, and I positioned myself to observe the north wall. The servitor patrol followed its usual route, a hulking labor unit with broad shoulders and industrial arms that served no apparent purpose in this context. As it passed the third panel, something changed. The panel's surface, which I had always assumed to be solid metal, flickered just for a moment, barely perceptible, like a PIC screen losing signal. Beneath the flicker, I saw something else. The outline of a doorway, or perhaps a window, and behind it the suggestion of movement, human movement. Then the servitor passed, and the panel was solid again, and I wondered if I had imagined it. That night, I asked Verson what I had seen. "Observers," he said simply. "The facility's real function isn't punishment, Voss. It's research. Every recollection session, every interaction, every moment of breakdown or resistance, it's all recorded, analyzed, catalogued. The Imperium is learning how to break and rebuild officer-class minds with precision. We are the test subjects. The data we generate is more valuable than any service we might provide in the field. Then why release anyone? To test the results. To see if the reconditioning holds under operational stress. To measure recidivism rates and failure patterns. He smiled without warmth. Every graduated officer is a walking experiment, and when they die or fail again, the data returns here to refine the process. I felt cold despite the cell's regulated temperature. You're saying we can't win, no matter what we choose. I'm saying the game is more complex than they want you to believe. Servitor conversion, reconsecration trial, permanent detention, those are the obvious paths. But there are others, if you know how to look. He tapped his data slate. I've been looking for 30 years. He said nothing more that night, and I lay awake trying to process what he had revealed. If the facility was a research apparatus, if every officer here was a subject rather than a prisoner, then every choice we made was being measured against some standard we could not see. And if Verson had discovered something beyond the three options, something that had kept him alive and aware for 3 decades, then perhaps there was hope. Or perhaps there was only a different kind of trap. I thought of the 217 marks he claimed to have counted. I thought of the officers I had seen: Keller, Thrace, Carter, and dozens of others whose names I did not know. I thought of Admiral Verson, who had supposedly graduated and been returned, who now sat 3 feet below me in the darkness, his breathing slow and steady, his mind occupied with calculations I could not yet comprehend. And I thought of myself, Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss, who had killed 4,000 souls through carelessness or incompetence or simple human error, and who was now being reshaped by an institution that saw failure not as a sin but as raw material. The question that kept me awake was not whether I would survive this place. It was whether the person who eventually walked out, if anyone walked out at all, would still be me. The 4th week marked a shift in the facility's treatment. My recollection sessions were moved to the afternoon, and a new element was introduced: verification. The data slate no longer simply recorded my confession, it challenged it. Timestamps that did not align, coordinates I claimed to have checked that had no record of access, conversations I remembered having that Vox logs could not confirm. Each discrepancy was presented without accusation, merely as data requiring explanation, but the cumulative effect was devastating. I began to doubt my own memory. Had I truly delegated the verification to my second officer, or had I simply failed to perform it and later invented the delegation to diffuse responsibility? Had the navigator's coordinates been precise, or had I misread them and constructed a false narrative of competence betrayed by circumstance? The more I tried to defend my recollection, the more the data slate revealed inconsistencies, until I could no longer distinguish between what I remembered and what I had been told I should remember. Verson watched this deterioration with clinical interest. He did not offer comfort, but neither did he allow me to collapse entirely. On the nights when I returned from recollection shaking and unable to speak, he would wait 30 minutes before beginning a conversation about something unrelated: fleet, logistics, naval history, the technical specifications of void shield generators. Dry, factual discussions that anchored me to something beyond the recursive nightmare of my own guilt. "They're softening you," he said one evening, his tone matter of fact, breaking down the certainties so they can rebuild the narrative according to their needs. "It's a standard technique. Administratum interrogators use variants of it, so do inquisitorial acolytes. The only difference here is patience. They have all the time in the world, and you have nowhere to go. How do I resist it? You don't. Resistance in this context is futile because you have no external anchors, no comrades to corroborate your memory, no logs you can access independently, no authority you can appeal to. You are alone with your guilt and their questions. And eventually, you will accept whichever version of events causes the least cognitive dissonance." He paused. "Unless you have access to something they don't control." "Like what?" He smiled, and for the first time since I had met him, the expression carried genuine satisfaction. "Like truth that predates their interference." That night, during the sleep cycle, Verson woke me with a touch so light I almost thought I had imagined it. He pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured for me to follow. We moved in darkness, our footsteps silent against the cell floor, and entered the washing alcove. It was a cramped space, barely large enough for both of us to stand, equipped with a single water spigot and a waste recycler. Verson closed the partition, a thin sheet of corroded metal that offered the illusion of privacy, and knelt beside the recycler housing. His fingers found a seam in the plating that I had never noticed, a gap so narrow it seemed like ordinary wear. He worked his fingernails into it and pried gently, and a section of the panel came free with a soft click. Behind it was a void space, and within that space, a data port, military grade, Imperial Navy standard, its connection pins still bright despite the dust that surrounded it. Previous occupant, Verson whispered. A tech adept who spent 3 years in this cell before being transferred to servitor conversion. He left gifts for those who knew how to look. From within his uniform, Verson produced a slender data cable, its ends modified with adapters I did not recognize. He connected one end to the hidden port and the other to his data slate. The screen flashed through a series of security protocols, then stabilized into an interface I had never seen, a directory structure marked with Mechanicus sigils and Administratum encryption stamps. "What is this?" I breathed. "The facility's archive, personnel records, processing logs, evaluation reports, everything they've recorded about every officer who has passed through this place." He scrolled through files with practiced efficiency. "It's not complete. Security partitions limit access, but it's enough. Enough to see the patterns. Enough to verify your own history before they finish rewriting it." He entered my name into a search field. A file appeared. Voss, Hadrian, LTCDR, Imperial Navy. He opened it, and I saw my service record rendered in cold bureaucratic detail. Commendations, deployments, disciplinary notes, none. And then the incident report. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking, because what I saw contradicted everything the recollection sessions had extracted from me. The coordinates had been correct. The navigator's calculations had been verified by my second officer and confirmed by the ship's machine spirit augurs. The collision had not been caused by my error, it had been caused by an unexpected warp eddy, a navigational hazard that occurred in less than 1% of translations. Impossible to predict, impossible to prevent. The report classified the incident as unavoidable catastrophic event. My arrest and detention were listed under a different heading: preventive intervention for psychological stabilization and command fitness evaluation. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my eyes lost focus. "They lied. They reconstructed," Verson corrected, his voice gentle. "Your failure was not technical, it was psychological. You survived an event that killed thousands, and the Imperium could not trust that you would remain functional under that weight. So they brought you here to reshape your understanding of what happened, to give you a narrative you could carry without breaking. A narrative where your error was clear, your guilt was justified, and your path to redemption was structured. But I didn't do anything wrong." "Exactly. And that's the problem." He closed the file and disconnected the cable, returning the panel to its place with practiced care. "The Imperium needs its officers to believe in their own agency. If you had been released with the truth that you were a victim of random chance, that 4,000 died because the universe is cruel and chaotic and indifferent, you would never be able to command again. You would hesitate at every decision, paralyzed by the knowledge that competence means nothing against the warp's whims." We returned to our bunks in silence. I lay in the darkness and tried to process what I had learned. Everything I had confessed in the recollection sessions was false. Every moment of guilt I had crystallized was built on manufactured evidence and guided narrative. I had been drowning in responsibility for a crime I had not committed, and the drowning itself was the point. "How many others?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Most," Verson replied from below. "Not all. Some officers here truly failed through incompetence or cowardice, but the majority are like you, victims of circumstance who need to be transformed into believers in their own guilt so they can continue to function. The facility's success rate is remarkable. 83% of processed officers return to service with improved performance metrics. And the others? 17% are deemed unrecoverable and converted to servitors or assigned permanent detention. The facility views this as acceptable waste." He shifted on his bunk, and I heard the faint creak of stressed metal. "I've watched this process repeat 217 times. Voss, 217 officers brought to this cell, shown the archive, forced to choose what they will do with the truth. What do most choose? They accept the lie. They return to recollection sessions and complete the crystallization process because the lie is bearable and the truth is not. Guilt can be atoned for, random catastrophe cannot. His voice carried a weight I had not heard before. Only 14 officers in 30 years have chosen differently. And what happened to them? They found the third option. The one I told you about. He paused. The one I chose. I wanted to ask more, but exhaustion and shock pressed against me with physical force. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what choice could exist beyond servitor conversion, reconsecration trial, or permanent detention. What path could Verson have walked that kept him alive and aware for 30 years? Neither broken nor released, neither servitor nor free. The answer came 3 days later, during a moment I had not anticipated. We were in the exercise yard, moving through the prescribed routines under the silent observation of servitor overseers, when an alarm sounded, a low, pulsing tone that I had never heard before. The servitors froze mid-motion, their mechanical systems entering standby mode, and the yard's lighting shifted from white to amber. Officers stopped moving, uncertainty rippling through the gathered population. Then the doors opened, and commissariat troopers entered in formation, their lasguns held at ready positions. They moved through the yard with purpose, selecting specific officers and guiding them toward the exit. I watched as Thrace was taken. He did not resist, simply followed with the resigned gait of a man who had been expecting this. Keller was not selected. Carter was. 7 officers total, all from different wings, all moving towards some destination the rest of us could only imagine. Verson stood beside me, his expression unchanged. When the troopers had departed and the servitors resumed their patrol routines, he leaned close and spoke in a voice meant only for me. Servitor conversion. Today's batch. They process in groups of 6 to 8, depending on facility capacity. He watched the doors seal shut. Thrace has been screaming for 3 weeks. They gave him longer than I expected. And Carter? Carter refused to crystallize. She maintained that her hesitation was morally correct, that the Imperium's doctrine was flawed. Principled defiance, admirable and utterly futile. He turned away from the doors. She'll be repurposed for labor servitor functions. Thrace will likely be combat configured. The Imperium wastes nothing. That night, I heard no weeping through the walls. The silence was worse than the sound had been. Verson used the archive 3 more times over the following weeks, always during sleep cycle, always with the same careful ritual of concealment. He showed me files on other officers, their true incident reports versus their processed confessions. The patterns were unmistakable. The facility took catastrophic events and transformed them into personal failures, giving the survivors a version of events they could control through self-flagellation and ritualized guilt. He showed me Keller's file. She had not made clerical errors. She had followed administratum protocols precisely, but those protocols were outdated by 15 years, never updated due to bureaucratic inertia at sector level. 17 million had died because the system was broken, but Keller was being taught to believe she was broken, and once she believed it, she would be released to work within the same system with renewed devotion. He showed me files on officers I did not know, names from years past. Some had graduated, some had been converted, some had died by suicide before processing was complete, a rare outcome, requiring failure of multiple surveillance systems, but not unknown, and some had simply vanished from the records, their files marked with a notation I did not recognize, reclassified, witness retention. What does that mean? I asked. Verson smiled. It means they found the third option. It means they chose to stay, not as prisoners awaiting redemption, but as permanent observers. The facility needs continuity. It needs officers who understand the process intimately, who can serve as behavioral anchors for new arrivals. Most detainees interact only with servitors and commissariat overseers, authority figures, enforcers, but some, like you, are paired with cellmates, and those cellmates serve a function. Understanding came slowly, then all at once. You're not a prisoner, you're staff. I'm both. I'm neither. He closed the data slate. I chose to witness, Voss. To remain here, aware and functional. serving as a catalyst for others. In exchange, I have access, limited, monitored, but real. I can see the archive. I can speak freely within certain boundaries. I can help officers like you understand what is being done to them before the process is complete. Why would you do that? Because 30 years ago, someone did it for me. An officer named Corin who had been here for 18 years. He showed me the archive. He showed me my file. He showed me the choice. Versen's expression grew distant, and when I graduated, when I served my 5 years aboard the St. Macarius, I believed I had escaped. I believed the facility had been defeated, but then they brought me back, and Corin was gone transferred, they said, though I never found his records, and I understood. The witness position is not permanent. It is rotational. When one witness is no longer useful, they are removed, and a new one is cultivated. So you're temporary too. Yes. But 30 years is longer than most. I've been useful. I've helped maintain the facility's efficiency by reducing resistance and accelerating crystallization among detainees who might otherwise become waste statistics. He met my eyes. 217 officers, Voss. I have guided them all. Most accepted the lie. 14 did not. What happened to the 14? They chose witness retention. They became what I am. And eventually, they were removed, and I never learned where they went. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Except one. One officer, 12 years ago, chose witness retention and was removed within 6 months. I found his file in the archive before it was scrubbed. He had been transferred to the White Wing. His status was listed as permanent containment, critical classification, exposure. The implications settled over me like a shroud. The third option was not freedom. It was another form of imprisonment, perhaps more insidious because it came with the illusion of purpose. Versen had been here for 30 years, serving the facility's function, trapped in a cycle of revelation and manipulation, knowing that eventually he too would be removed when his usefulness ended. Why tell me this? I asked. Why show me the archive if the outcome is the same? Because you deserve to choose with full knowledge, because the Imperium thrives on ignorance and enforced narratives, and every act of true awareness is a small rebellion, even if it changes nothing. He leaned back against the wall, and because in 14 cases out of 217, the officers I guided chose something other than what the facility intended, the statistical anomaly bothers them. It suggests I am not as reliable an instrument as they believe, and every instance of unreliability brings them closer to removing me. You're trying to sabotage your own position. I'm trying to end it before it ends me. There is dignity in that choice, however small. He closed his eyes. You have 2 months remaining before they offer you the choice. Use that time to decide what version of yourself you want to carry forward. The useful lie, the unbearable truth, or something else entirely. I spent those 2 months in a state of suspended contradiction. I continued attending recollection sessions, but I no longer accepted the narrative they constructed. I spoke the words they wanted to hear while holding my true memory separate, protected, inviolate. It was exhausting. It felt like trying to carry 2 mutually exclusive realities in the same mind, and some days I was not sure which version was real. Versen monitored my progress with the attention of a naval tactician managing a complex operation. He would quiz me during sleep cycle, asking me to recount my incident report from both perspectives, the facility's version and the archive's truth. He taught me how to perform compliance without belief, how to crystallize guilt on the surface while maintaining awareness beneath. You're preparing me for something, I said one night. I'm preparing you to survive the choice, whatever you decide, he replied. If you choose the trial, you'll need to perform competence without the paralysis of manufactured guilt. If you choose witness retention, you'll need to understand how to maintain dual consciousness indefinitely. And if you choose servitor conversion or permanent detention, he paused. Well, those require no preparation. The months passed. Keller graduated and was removed, her crystallization complete, her face serene with the peace of accepted guilt. New officers arrived to take the empty cells. The facility's machine continued its work, grinding through human minds with industrial efficiency, and through it all, Versen counted. 218, 219, 220. Each new cellmate another tally, another opportunity for revelation. Another small act of rebellion against the system he served. I began to understand why he had remained for 30 years. Not because he was trapped, but because he had found the only form of resistance available to him. He could not destroy the facility, he could not free its prisoners, but he could inject truth into the machinery, one officer at a time, and watch as some chose differently than intended. It was a patient form of sabotage, a slow erosion of efficiency, a statistical anomaly that might, over decades, force the Imperium to question the reliability of its own methods. Or perhaps it was simply the last desperate act of a man who refused to accept complete powerlessness. Either way, I found myself grateful for it. When the 78th day arrived and I was summoned for the choice, I walked toward that meeting with full knowledge of what I was and what I had not done. The facility had tried to reshape me, but Verson had given me the tools to resist that reshaping. Whether those tools would be enough, I would soon discover. The summons came during morning ration distribution. A commissariat officer I had never seen before entered our cell, not a trooper, but a full officer, his uniform immaculate, his face hidden behind a ceremonial rebreather mask that rendered his features inhuman. He carried a data slate that he did not consult, as if my identity was already confirmed by my mere presence in this cell. Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss. You are summoned to evaluation. Attend immediately. Verson did not look up from his own ration container. He simply continued eating with mechanical precision, as if this moment was entirely expected and entirely unremarkable. I stood, my legs steady despite the fear that coiled in my chest, and followed the commissar into the corridor. We did not descend to the recollection chambers. Instead, we ascended up through levels I had never accessed, past checkpoints where armored doors slid open at the commissar's approach and sealed behind us with pneumatic finality. The architecture changed as we climbed. The lower levels had been utilitarian, all exposed metal and basic function. Here, the walls were paneled in dark wood, the lumen strips replaced by actual candles in iron sconces, the floor covered in carpet that muffled our footsteps. It felt like entering a cathedral or a tomb. The commissar stopped before a door marked only with the Imperial Aquila rendered in gold leaf. He opened it and gestured for me to enter alone. The room beyond was circular, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling painted in a mural I could not quite pass figures in naval uniforms ascending toward a golden light, or perhaps descending into it. The ambiguity seemed intentional. At the room's center stood a table, and behind the table sat 3 figures. The first was another commissar, this one without a mask, his face weathered and scarred in a way that suggested decades of service. The second was an administratum adept, her augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they focused on me, recording every detail. The third was a naval officer whose rank insignia marked her as a captain, her uniform bearing commendations I recognized from fleet actions in the Segmentum Obscurus. Sit, the commissar said, indicating a chair positioned opposite the table. I sat. The chair was uncomfortable by design, its angles wrong, its height forcing me to look slightly upward at my evaluators. Another small psychological edge. The Imperium left nothing to chance. The administratum adept consulted her data slate, though I suspected she was not actually reading it, merely performing a ritual of bureaucratic legitimacy. When she spoke, her voice was rendered flat and toneless by vox augmentation. Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss, service record, 12 years. Commendations, 4. Incident, catastrophic warp translation, resulting in 4,273 casualties. Processing duration, 81 days. Crystallization index, 73%. Psychological stability, marginal. Recommendation pending. The naval captain leaned forward, her expression neutral. You understand why you are here? Yes, I said, because there was no value in pretending otherwise. Then we will not waste time on preamble. The Imperium has invested considerable resources in your evaluation and rehabilitation. Your crystallization index suggests partial success. You acknowledge your failure, but resistance remains. This places you in a liminal category, neither fully recovered nor fully irredeemable. She paused. You will now be offered a choice. Listen carefully. You will not be asked twice. The commissar took over, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Option 1, servitor conversion. Your mind will be wiped. Your body augmented for labor or combat functions as determined by Mechanicus evaluation. You will serve the Emperor in capacity suited to your physical frame. Your service record will be sealed. Your name will be struck from active rosters. You will continue to exist, but not as you are. He waited, as if expecting me to react. I remained silent. Option 2. Reconsecration Trial. You will be placed in command of a simulated fleet engagement, replicating the scenario of your original failure. You will be evaluated by Senior Naval Command and Commissariat oversight. Success results in rank restoration and reassignment with full honors. Failure results in immediate servitor conversion without appeal. He leaned back. The trial will occur in real-time simulation with full neural interface. Psychological stress will be equivalent to actual combat conditions. Approximately 40% of officers who attempt the trial suffer permanent psychological damage regardless of outcome. This is considered acceptable risk, the Administratum Adept added, without inflection. Historical success rate for reconsecration trial, 62%. Of successful candidates, 89% return to active service with improved command metrics. 11% are released to administrative or training roles due to residual trauma. The naval captain folded her hands on the table. You have 60 seconds to declare your choice. After declaration, you will have 24 hours to prepare. The trial will commence at 0800 tomorrow. If you choose servitor conversion, processing will begin immediately. I felt the weight of their attention, 3 sets of eyes measuring me against standards I could not see. Versen's words echoed in my mind. They didn't tell you about the third option, did they? Is there a third option? I asked. The silence that followed was absolute. The Administratum Adept's augmetic eyes stopped clicking. The Commissar's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested I had said something unexpected. The naval captain's gaze sharpened. Explain your question, she said. Permanent detention. Refusal of both servitor conversion and trial. Acceptance of indefinite imprisonment. I kept my voice level, neither challenging nor pleading. I have been informed this option exists. The 3 evaluators exchanged glances. The Commissar spoke first, his tone carefully controlled. That option is available only under specific circumstances. It is not presented during standard evaluation because it represents failure to achieve facility objectives. Officers who choose permanent detention are statistically unlikely to provide value to the Imperium in any capacity. But it exists. Yes. The naval captain's expression was unreadable. You may refuse both conversion and trial. You will remain in this facility indefinitely. No release. No contact with external personnel. No change in status until biological termination. This choice is irrevocable. She paused. Why would you consider this? Because Versen chose something else entirely, I thought. Because 14 officers before me chose differently than intended. Because the facility's efficiency is not absolute, and every anomaly is a crack in the machinery, but I could not say those things. Instead, I said, I need to understand the full scope of my options before making a decision that affects the remainder of my existence. The Administratum Adept made a notation on her data slate. Psychological profile update. Subject exhibits elevated capacity for systematic analysis and delayed decision-making. Crystallization resistance confirmed. Recommend trial assignment with heightened observation protocols. The Commissar nodded slowly. Very well. You have identified the third option. For the record, it is available. However, I will note that in the facility's operational history, fewer than 1% of evaluated officers have chosen permanent detention. Those who do are typically transferred to research applications where their continued consciousness serves specific institutional needs. He leaned forward. You will not simply be warehoused, Voss, you will be used. The nature of that use is not disclosed prior to selection. Research applications. Witness retention. The words were different, but the meaning was clear. The third option led to Versen's fate: permanent imprisonment disguised as purpose, serving as a behavioral instrument for future detainees until usefulness expired. I understand, I said. I choose the trial. The tension in the room shifted, not quite relaxing but losing some of its predatory edge. The naval captain nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps approval. Wise. The trial will commence at 0800. You will be escorted to preparation chambers at 0600. Use the intervening time as you see fit. Dismissed. I stood, saluted an automatic gesture, muscle memory from 12 years of service, and turned toward the door. As I reached it, the commissar spoke again. "Voss, one final note. Your cellmate has served this facility with distinction for many years. His guidance is valued. However, you should understand that his role is not that of advocate or friend. He is an instrument of the facility's function, as are we all. Do not mistake familiarity for loyalty." I did not respond. I simply left, following the same commissariat officer back down through the levels, past the checkpoints, down into the red-lit corridors of my wing. When I reached my cell, Verson was waiting, his expression expectant. "You chose the trial," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He nodded slowly, something like satisfaction crossing his features. "Good. You would not have survived witness retention. You're too resistant, too aware. They would have broken you within a year and transferred you to White Wing." He gestured to my bunk. "Sit. We have 24 hours. I'm going to teach you how to pass." What followed was the most intensive training I had ever received. Verson transformed from cryptic observer to exacting instructor, drilling me through scenarios, decision trees, tactical algorithms. He drew diagrams on the cell floor using moisture from the washing alcove, crude representations of fleet formations and warp space geometries. He quizzed me relentlessly, accepting no hesitation, no approximation, demanding precision in every answer. "The trial will replicate your original scenario, but it will introduce variables," he explained. "Unexpected eddy currents, communication delays, equipment malfunctions. They're testing whether you can adapt under pressure, whether the crystallization process has made you reactive rather than proactive. You need to command as if the failure never happened, not because you've forgotten it, but because you've integrated it without being paralyzed by it. How do you know what the trial involves? Because I took it 30 years ago, and I passed." His smile was bitter. "And then I served for 5 years, and they brought me back, and I learned that passing was not the same as winning." He taught me breathing techniques to manage neural interface stress. He taught me command cadences that projected confidence without arrogance. He taught me how to prioritize information flow during chaotic engagement, how to delegate without second-guessing, how to make decisions with incomplete data and commit to them absolutely. "The moment you hesitate, you fail," he said. "Not because hesitation is wrong, sometimes it's correct, but because the trial is not measuring tactical soundness. It's measuring crystallized guilt. They want to see if you've been transformed into an officer who acts without the burden of his own humanity. That's what reconsecration means. You are no longer a person who failed. You are a tool that has been repaired." At some point during the night, I asked him the question I had been avoiding. "What happened when you graduated? You said you served for 5 years. What changed?" He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the cell feel smaller. "I commanded with distinction. I made no errors. I was efficient, ruthless when necessary, capable of sacrificing assets for strategic gain without hesitation. I had been reconsecrated perfectly, my humanity subsumed into function, my guilt transformed into precision." He stared at his hands. "And then one day, during a fleet action against Orc raiders, I hesitated. Just for a moment. A troop transport was caught in a crossfire, and I had the option to sacrifice it to secure a firing solution on the Orc flagship. The tactically sound choice was obvious, but I hesitated. I found an alternative that saved the transport. It cost us 12 minutes and increased risk to my own vessel. But I saved 3,000 guard personnel. That sounds like good command. It was, but it was also evidence that the crystallization had not held. I had acted based on moral consideration rather than pure tactical calculus. I had regained my humanity, which meant I had regained the capacity to fail in the same way again. So they recalled me. They told me I was being reassigned to training duties, and then they brought me here and offered me a choice. Witness retention or White Wing. I chose to witness, and you've been here ever since. Yes, guiding officers through the process, serving as proof that rehabilitation is possible, injecting enough truth into the system to create anomalies without destroying it entirely." He met my eyes. "You are anomaly number 15. Voss, if you pass the trial tomorrow, you will be released. You will serve, and in 5 years, or 10, or whenever your humanity resurfaces, they will bring you back. And you will face the same choice I did, unless I fail the trial. If you fail, you become a servitor, and the anomaly ends. If you pass, the anomaly perpetuates." He smiled. "Either outcome serves the facility's function, but one of them leaves you aware enough to choose what happens next." I did not sleep that night. I spent the hours reviewing everything Verson had taught me, running through scenarios in my mind, preparing for a trial that would determine whether I remained human or became something else. When morning cycle arrived and the commissariat escort came to collect me, I was ready. Verson stood as I left. For the first time since I had met him, he offered a salute, not a formal naval salute, but something older, a gesture of respect between soldiers who had seen the same battlefield. 220, he said quietly. "Make it count." The preparation chamber was sterile white, dominated by a command throne fitted with neural interface connections. Tech priests in Mechanicus Crimson moved around the space with insectile efficiency, calibrating equipment and chanting binaric prayers to the machine spirits. The naval captain from the evaluation was present, along with 2 commissars I did not recognize. They strapped me into the throne. The neural interface was a crown of connector cables that locked onto ports I did not remember having. The tech priests had installed them while I was unconscious. I realized surgical modification performed without consent or awareness. Another violation so routine it required no explanation. The captain's voice came through a Vox speaker. "The trial will begin in 60 seconds. You will experience full sensory immersion. The scenario will be identical to your original incident with introduced variables. Time compression ratio, 1 hour simulated per 10 minutes real. Failure states, catastrophic casualty count, loss of command vessel, or psychological breakdown requiring emergency extraction. Success states, mission completion with acceptable losses and maintained command coherence. Commence on my mark." The world dissolved into light. When consciousness reformed, I was on the bridge of the Validus Irae. My bridge, my command. The crew moved through their stations with familiar efficiency. The view screens showed the void, starfield distorted by warp proximity. We were preparing for translation. The moment I had lived and died 1,000 times in recollection. But this time, I was not recalling. I was commanding. "Navigator, confirm coordinates." I ordered, my voice steady. "Coordinates confirmed, sir. Translation window in 12 minutes. Weapons, status. All batteries nominal. Void shields at full charge. Helm, confirm alignment. Alignment locked, sir." Awaiting translation mark. Everything proceeded exactly as I remembered, and then it didn't. The navigator's voice cracked with sudden urgency. "Sir, detecting spatial anomaly. Warp eddy forming along our translation vector. Recommend immediate abort." This had not happened in my original incident. This was the trial's variable. I had microseconds to decide. "Magnitude?" I snapped. "Class 3. Navigable but hazardous. Risk factor. I don't need the risk factor. I need a clean vector. Can you compensate?" "Negative, sir. Eddy is too close. We need to abort and recalculate." The constant vigil was 30,000 kilometers to starboard, following our vector. If we aborted, would they have time to adjust? If we translated into the eddy, what were the actual chances of successful transit versus catastrophic failure? Verson's voice echoed in my memory. "The moment you hesitate, you fail. All vessels. Emergency Vox. Abort translation." I repeat, abort translation. "Navigator, recalculate for safe vector. Helm, execute evasive drift, pattern Delta 7. Weapons, maintain alert status." I keyed the fleet channel. Constant vigil. "This is Validus Irae. Translation, aborted due to spatial hazard. Stand by for updated coordinates." "Acknowledge. Validus Irae. Acknowledged. Standing by." The navigator worked in furious concentration, her choir singing calculations in harmonized mathematics. 2 minutes passed. 5. 8. The warp eddy intensified on our sensors, a churning wound in reality that would have torn both ships apart had we translated. "New vector calculated, sir. Clean passage, 97% confidence. Fleet coordination, confirm all vessels updated and locked." "Confirm, sir. Translation in 3 minutes. All hands, prepare for warp incursion." The moment came, the reality shudder, the endless instant of translation. And then we were through, emerged in real space intact, both vessels reporting nominal status. 0 casualties. The scenario continued, introducing new crises, weapons malfunction, Vox corruption, a debris field that required navigation. I met each one with decisions that felt less like command and more like reflex. The training version had drilled into me operating faster than conscious thought. 3 hours compressed time, 12 real minutes. When the scenario terminated and the neural interface released me, I was drenched in sweat, my muscles locked from prolonged tension, my mind struggling to separate simulation from reality. The naval captain's face appeared in my vision, her expression unreadable. Trial complete. Evaluating performance. The wait was eternal and instantaneous. Tech priests disconnected me from the throne, but I remained seated, too drained to stand. Finally, the captain spoke. Acceptable performance. 0 critical failures. Command coherence maintained throughout. Casualty count, 0. Recommendation, rank restoration and reassignment. She paused. Welcome back to the fleet, Lieutenant Commander Voss. I should have felt relief. Victory. Validation. Instead, I felt nothing but the hollow knowledge that I had passed a test designed to measure how completely I had been reshaped. I was no longer the officer who had entered this facility. I was a reconsecrated instrument, honed and calibrated, returned to service. They released me that day. No ceremony, no formal acknowledgement, just a return of my rank insignia, a data slate with reassignment orders, and an escort to the docking bay. As I boarded the transport shuttle, I looked back at the penitent spire one last time. Somewhere inside, Verson was counting. 221, 222, his quiet rebellion continuing, one anomaly at a time, until the day they finally removed him and erased his existence. I did not know if I was truly free, or if I had simply been transferred to a larger cell, but I knew I would find out in 5 years, or sooner. The reassignment orders directed me to the strike cruiser Morningstar's Wrath, a vessel assigned to patrol operations in the Segmentum Ultima border regions. The journey took 3 weeks via chartered transport, enough time for the neural interface modifications to fully heal and for the facility's programming to settle into whatever shape it would ultimately take. I spent those weeks reading fleet briefings and tactical assessments, preparing myself to resume command as if the past 3 months had been nothing more than administrative leave. The lie was easier than I expected. When I arrived at the Morningstar's Wrath, the ship's captain, a weathered veteran named Thorne, whose service record spanned 4 decades, greeted me with professional courtesy, but none of the warmth typically extended to new officers. His eyes moved across my uniform with practiced assessment, cataloging details I could not see but knew he was recording. When his gaze settled on my collar, he nodded once, a gesture that conveyed understanding without requiring explanation. Lieutenant Commander Voss, welcome aboard. You'll be serving as second officer, Tactical Coordination Primary. Report to your station at 0600 tomorrow. Dismissed. No questions about my previous posting. No inquiries about the gap in my service record. Just acknowledgement and assignment, as if I were any other officer cycling through the fleet's vast personnel apparatus. I saluted and left, making my way to the junior officers' quarters where my bunk and locker awaited. It was only later, alone in the refresher chamber, that I saw what Thorne had seen. On my uniform collar, just below the rank insignia, was a small mark I had not noticed during processing. It was subtle, a thin red line, perhaps 2 centimeters long, worked into the fabric itself rather than added as a patch or pin. In most lighting it was barely visible, but in the harsh illumination of the refresher, it stood out like a brand. I touched it, wondering if it was a flaw in the uniform's manufacture. But the fabric was seamless, the mark integral to the weave. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. This was the Imperium signature on its reconsecrated property, a signal visible to those who knew to look for it, but invisible to those who did not. I understood immediately what it meant. Every officer I served with would know, without words, that I had been processed, that I had failed once, that I had been rebuilt. The mark was not quite a scarlet letter. It did not bar me from service, but it was a permanent notation, a reminder that competence could be restored but trust could not be unbroken. The next morning, I reported to my station. The bridge of the Morningstar's Wrath was smaller than the Validus Irae, configured for speed and maneuverability rather than sustained engagement. The crew moved with the efficiency of veterans, their coordination suggesting years of service together. I took my position at the tactical coordination console and began reviewing system status, familiarizing myself with the ship's capabilities and current operational parameters. Captain Thorne acknowledged my presence with a nod, but did not speak. The shift proceeded in routine silence, patrol vector monitoring, sensor sweep analysis, Vox traffic assessment. Standard operations for a border patrol vessel in a region where nothing happened for months at a time, and then everything happened at once. 3 hours into the shift, Thorne called me to the command dais. "Voss, you're familiar with the reconsecration protocol?" The question was not casual. "Yes, sir." "Then you understand that your performance is being monitored more closely than standard crew. Weekly evaluations will be transmitted to Naval Command via encrypted channels. Any deviation from expected performance metrics will result in immediate recall and re-evaluation." He paused. "This is not meant as threat or insult. It is simply operational reality. The Imperium invests considerable resources in officers like you. That investment must be protected." "I understand, sir." "Good. Then we have no issues. Perform your duties with competence, and the monitoring will become background noise." "Fail." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Dismissed. I returned to my station, the weight of surveillance settling over me like a physical presence. Somewhere, algorithms were processing my every decision, comparing them against baseline metrics, searching for patterns of dysfunction or regression. I was not simply serving, I was being tested, continuously, indefinitely, until either I proved reliable or I proved defective. The weeks became months. I performed my duties with the precision the facility had instilled. I made no errors. I showed no hesitation. I became the model of reconsecrated competence, an officer who functioned exactly as designed. The crew grew accustomed to my presence, though I noticed they maintained a subtle distance, professional but never familiar, competent but never warm. The mark on my collar created an invisible boundary that no amount of successful performance could cross. I did not mind the isolation. In some ways, it was easier than pretending I was unchanged. The facility had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. I found I could make decisions that once would have troubled me, sacrificing assets for tactical advantage, accepting casualties as necessary costs, prioritizing mission success over individual survival. The crystallization had not held completely, but it had left residue, altering the calculations I performed beneath conscious thought. I was more efficient, more ruthless, more machine than man, and I hated it. 5 months into my posting, we received distress signals from an administratum convoy under attack by Orc raiders. The engagement was straightforward: 3 Orc cruisers against our strike cruiser and 2 escort frigates. Captain Thorne ordered immediate intercept, and I coordinated the tactical response with the same cold precision I had demonstrated in the trial. We destroyed 2 of the Orc vessels and drove off the 3rd. The convoy was saved. Casualty count: 43 crew killed, 217 wounded. Acceptable losses for the mission profile. Thorne commended my performance in his official report. That night, I lay in my bunk and counted the dead. 43 names I would never know. Lives ended because of decisions I had made in fractions of seconds, calculations that weighed their existence against strategic outcomes and found them expendable. The old version of myself, the officer who had entered the penitent spire, would have mourned them, would have questioned whether different tactics might have saved more, would have carried their deaths as weight. The reconsecrated version simply noted the number and moved on. I realized then that Verson had been right. The facility's purpose was not punishment or rehabilitation. It was transformation. It took officers who had retained too much humanity, who hesitated because they valued life beyond tactical calculations, and burned that humanity away, replacing it with crystallized efficiency. I had been remade into an instrument that could kill without hesitation, because hesitation was the true failure. And the mark on my collar ensured that everyone knew I had been remade, that I was no longer entirely human, that I was a tool that had been repaired and returned to service. The months continued. Patrols, engagements, routine operations punctuated by violence and measured by casualty counts. I performed with distinction. My evaluations were exemplary. I was promoted to full commander 8 months into my posting, a rapid advancement that suggested Naval Command was pleased with their investment's returns. I should have been proud. I felt nothing but distant observation, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold through a viewport. It was 11 months into my posting when the Vox message arrived. It came through a private channel, audio only, no origin signature, no encryption, just a voice I recognized despite the years and distance. Versen's voice. "You'll understand in 5 years. Or sooner. They're always watching the marked ones." The message lasted 4 seconds. I played it 17 times, analyzing every inflection, every breath, searching for hidden meaning or warning. But there was nothing beyond the words themselves, a simple statement of fact, a reminder that the monitoring was not temporary, that the mark was not merely symbolic, that I was property under observation. I did not know if Versen was still in the penitent spire. I did not know if he was still alive. The message could have been recorded years ago, set to transmit on a delayed schedule. It could have been automated, a final act of rebellion programmed to reach every officer he had guided, or it could have been recent, evidence that he was still counting, still witnessing, still performing his quiet sabotage against the machinery of Imperial reconditioning. I wanted to respond, but there was no return channel. The message had come from nowhere and could be answered by nothing, so I simply continued. I served with competence. I made decisions that killed people I would never meet. I wore the mark on my collar and endured the subtle isolation it created. I became what the Imperium needed me to be, a functional instrument, reliable and ruthless, stripped of the weaknesses that had made me hesitate. The years passed. 2 years, 3, 4. I was promoted again, to captain, given command of my own frigate. The monitoring continued, invisible but constant. I made no errors. I showed no signs of regression. I was the model success story of the reconsecration protocol, and every night, I lay in my quarters and wondered when they would bring me back, when they would determine that the crystallization was degrading, that my humanity was resurfacing, that I required additional processing. I waited for the commissariat aides to appear at my door with their silent summons, for the transport to the penitent spire, for the return to that cell where Versen might or might not still be counting. But the summons never came. 4 years became 5. 5 became 6. I continued to serve. The mark remained on my collar, faded slightly by time but still visible to those who knew to look. And gradually, I began to understand what Versen had been trying to tell me. The facility had not failed to crystallize my guilt. It had succeeded in making me believe it had failed. The trial had not measured my competence. It had measured my capacity to function while carrying the weight of imposed guilt, to perform despite believing myself broken and remade. The mark was not evidence of my transformation. It was evidence that I accepted the transformation, that I believed myself to be a tool that had been repaired rather than a person who had survived. The true reconditioning was not the sessions or the archive or the neural interface trial. It was the release itself, the act of returning me to service while making me believe I was under permanent surveillance, that I was marked and monitored, and one mistake away from recall. The Imperium did not need to watch me continuously. It needed me to believe I was being watched, to police my own thoughts and actions, to transform myself into the instrument they required through internalized control. I was not a prisoner who had been released. I was a prisoner who had been convinced the entire galaxy was his cell. The realization should have been liberating. Instead, it was devastating, because even knowing the mechanism of control, I could not escape it. The mark was real. The monitoring was real, even if less comprehensive than I had believed. And the capacity for recall was real. The Imperium did bring officers back. Versen was proof. The only question was whether my awareness of the system would be interpreted as regression or as successful integration. I did not know the answer. I did not know if there was a correct response. I only knew that I would continue to serve, continue to function, continue to carry the weight of a failure I had not committed and a transformation I could not undo. Because that was what reconsecration meant. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. I was no longer Lieutenant Commander Hadrian Voss, who had survived a catastrophic accident. I was Commander Voss, who had been processed, evaluated, rebuilt, and returned to service with a mark that would follow me until biological termination or final failure. The Imperium did not forgive, it utilized. And I was being utilized with perfect efficiency, my horror at my own transformation serving as the engine of my compliance. 7 years into my posting, I received new orders. Reassignment to Training Command. I would be teaching tactical doctrine to officer candidates at a naval academy in the Segmentum Solar. The orders were phrased as promotion and recognition of exemplary service, but I understood what they truly meant. I had aged out of frontline command. The monitoring had detected no regression significant enough to warrant recall, but neither had it detected the kind of crystallized perfection that would justify continued operational deployment. So I was being moved to a position where I could still serve the Imperium's function, training the next generation of officers while being kept at a distance from actual command authority. I was being transitioned from instrument to instructor. My experience as a reconsecrated officer, more valuable as a teaching tool than as active service. I accepted the orders without question. I reported to the academy. I taught tactical doctrine with the precision the facility had instilled, and I saw, in my students' eyes, the same fear I had once carried, the terror of failure, the knowledge that a single error could end not just their careers, but their humanity. Some of them would fail. Some would be sent to facilities like the Penitent Spire. Some would be reconsecrated and returned to service with marks on their collars, and they would serve as I had served, believing themselves watched, believing themselves transformed, never quite certain whether they were officers or instruments or something in between. The cycle would continue. The Imperium's machinery would grind on, taking broken components and reshaping them into useful tools, extracting function from failure, ensuring that nothing, not lives, not minds, not even guilt, was ever wasted. I thought of Verson often during those years. I wondered if he was still in the Penitent Spire, still counting, still injecting truth into the system one anomaly at a time. I wondered if he had been removed, transferred to White Wing, or some other fate. I wondered if he had ever truly existed, or if he too had been a construct, a behavioral instrument designed to give me the illusion of resistance while ensuring my ultimate compliance. I would never know. The Imperium did not answer such questions. 10 years after my release, I received one final message. It came through the same private channel, the same anonymous transmission, the same 4-second duration. 220. Make it count. Verson's voice, unchanged by time. A reminder, a challenge, an acknowledgement that whatever I had become, whatever the facility had made me, I still carried the awareness he had given me. I was still anomaly number 15. I was still capable of choosing, even if that choice was only how I interpreted my own existence. I did not respond. I simply continued, teaching, serving, wearing the mark, carrying the knowledge that I was both prisoner and warden, both tool and operator, both victim and perpetrator of the Imperium's machinery. The horror was not that I had been broken. The horror was that I had been rebuilt so well that I could function perfectly while knowing exactly what had been done to me. And in the end, that knowledge changed nothing. I continued to serve. I continued to function. I continued to teach others how to serve and function in their turn, because that was what the Imperium required, and I had been reconsecrated to provide exactly what the Imperium required. My awareness of the process serving not as liberation but as the final, perfect proof of my reconditioning. I am Commander Hadrian Voss. I wear the mark. I serve the Emperor, and I will never be free.